In the center of a quiet European town stood an enormous clock tower, rising above the rooftops like a sentinel watching over the ages. For generations, its presence was so deeply ingrained in the landscape that no one questioned how it had come to be. Children grew up playing in its shadow. Merchants set their stalls beneath its walls. Travelers from distant lands always stopped to marvel at the sheer size and intricate craftsmanship of the tower. Yet when historians began to investigate its history, they uncovered a startling mystery. No records existed to explain who had built it or when it had been constructed. The town's archives, otherwise full of details about churches, bridges, and even the smallest of homes, were completely silent on the origins of the clock. This absence was more than an oversight. It was as if the clock had appeared one day, whole and complete, with no trace of human effort behind it. The clock itself was no ordinary timepiece. Its face was crafted from polished brass that had not dulled even after centuries of exposure to sun and rain. The numerals etched into its dial were not Roman, nor Arabic, nor any recognizable script used in Europe. Instead, they resembled flowing symbols that seemed to shift depending on the light, as though they were alive. Around the central hands of the clock, tiny inscriptions circled the dial, their meaning unknown but captivating to anyone who dared to study them for too long. Some townspeople swore they could see entire patterns emerge, as if the symbols were trying to tell a story written in the language of time itself. Local legends began to grow around the clock's mysterious origin. Some claimed it was the work of master craftsmen who belonged to a secret society, a brotherhood of artisans who had inherited knowledge from civilizations far older than the town itself. Others insisted that the clock was a gift from travelers who had come from distant lands, carrying with them wisdom that blended astronomy, engineering, and mysticism. A few whispered darker tales, suggesting that the clock had been forged in a pact between men and forces beyond the natural world. Its gears infused with secrets that ordinary minds could not comprehend. The design of the tower only deepened the mystery. Unlike other buildings in the town, which followed familiar Gothic or Renaissance styles, the clock tower was a strange blend of forms. Its base was built from massive stones, cut so precisely that even a blade of grass could not fit between them. Higher up, the structure featured arches and carvings of celestial bodies, suns, moons, and stars, aligned in ways that mirrored constellations only visible at certain times of the year. At its very top sat a bell cast in metal unlike anything seen elsewhere in Europe, a bell that produced a sound both deep and haunting, resonating through the entire town with a vibration that seemed to reach into the chest of anyone who heard it. Travelers who visited the town often remarked that the tower seemed out of place, as if it did not belong to the same era as the streets and houses that surrounded it. Some even claimed it resembled structures found in distant parts of the world, drawing comparisons to ancient temples or monuments whose builders had long since vanished. These similarities gave rise to speculation that the clock might not be European in origin at all, but rather a relic of knowledge passed down through hidden channels, carried across continents by wandering scholars, traders, or even exiled builders. As time passed, scholars grew increasingly intrigued by the idea that the clock was not merely a machine to measure hours, but something far greater. The symbols etched into its brass frame, the unusual alignment of its carvings with the stars, and the sheer precision of its mechanism suggested an understanding of mathematics and astronomy centuries ahead of its supposed time. Some theorists believe that whoever created the clock had access to knowledge that had been lost to the rest of humanity, fragments of an ancient science that blurred the line between engineering and prophecy. Others argued that the clock's existence pointed toward civilizations far older than anyone imagined. Civilizations that had mastered the secrets of time but had vanished without leaving any trace other than artifacts like this. The townspeople themselves had their own view. To them, the clock was both a guardian and a mystery. They did not need to understand its inscriptions or decipher its origins to feel its presence. It was as though the tower was alive, a watchful, an entity that observed the passage of days and silently held within it the memory of ages gone by. Elders told children stories of how the clock had always been there, standing before their grandparents and their grandparents' grandparents were born. Some even believed that the tower had existed since the dawn of the town. Older than its streets, older even than the land itself. This combination of missing records, strange design, unrecognizable symbols, and uncanny precision created an enduring question that scholars, locals, travelers all struggled with. How could such a structure exist without leaving behind a trace of its creators? Was it possible that it had been deliberately erased from history? Its makers choosing to remain anonymous because the clock held secrets too dangerous for ordinary people to know? Or had time itself swallowed the memory of its construction, leaving behind only the finished monument as a silent puzzle? The origins of the clock remain one of the most haunting enigmas of the town. It was not merely a structure to mark the hours. It was a reminder of forgotten knowledge, of builders whose identities had been swallowed by history, and of mysteries carved into brass and stone that defied explanation. The clock tower did not just rise over the town like any other monument. It loomed as a silent testament to secrets lost in the currents of time. A machine born from unknown hands that dared to shape the future through the rhythm of its ceaseless ticking. As the years passed, the clock tower revealed qualities that defied the expectations of even the most skeptical observers. At first, the townspeople believed it to be only a magnificent, though mysterious, timekeeping device, its gears and pendulums. A marvel of engineering beyond their comprehension. But soon, rumors began to spread that the clock did more than mark the passing of hours and days. It appeared to foretell events as though it could bend the linear march of time to reveal glimpses of what was yet to come. The first incidents seemed coincidental, small occurrences that could be dismissed as the imagination of those who longed for wonder in their otherwise ordinary lives. Yet as the stories grew, the pattern became undeniable, and the whispers of superstition transformed into awed conviction. One of the earliest accounts involved a farmer who lived on the outskirts of the town. Each morning he would rise before dawn and glance up at the tower to check the time. On one particular day, he noticed something strange. The clock's hands did not mark the usual hour, but seemed frozen at an odd angle, neither pointing to a proper numeral nor moving with their usual precision. Troubled by the sight, he delayed his departure for the fields. Later that morning, a sudden storm swept across the valley, uprooting trees and flooding the farmlands where he would have been working. Had he gone at his usual time, he would almost certainly have been caught in the deluge. He claimed that the clock had warned him, and when he returned to the village, his tales spread quickly. At first, the townsfolk dismissed his story, but within weeks others began to report similar experiences. Merchants spoke of strange patterns in the clock's symbols, which sometimes shimmered in the sunlight and seemed to realign themselves into shapes that resembled familiar objects. One trader swore that he had seen the image of a ship etched faintly across the brass surface of the dial, though the next morning the markings were gone. Days later, news reached the town that a trading vessel had sunk in the nearby river after striking an unseen sandbar, carrying with it the fortunes of several wealthy families. For those who had studied the clock carefully, the prediction had been plain, though cryptic in form. From then on, merchants began to keep a wary eye on the tower, uncertain whether its messages were warnings, omens, or mere tricks of perception. The uncanny predictions became too numerous to ignore. A group of scholars from neighboring cities journeyed to study the clock after hearing reports of its abilities. They recorded instances in which the tower's bell would toll at unusual times, without being struck by human hands, only for some extraordinary event to unfold within hours. On one occasion, the bell rang 12 times at midday, though it had never done so before. That evening, a fire broke out in a nearby village, destroying a dozen homes but miraculously sparing every life. The scholars noted that the 12 tolls seemed to correspond to the 12 families who lived in that village, as if the clock itself had been marking them in its own way. As investigations deepened, a curious pattern emerged. The clock did not reveal predictions in plain or obvious terms. Its messages were always shrouded in mystery, requiring interpretation. Sometimes they came through the misalignment of the hands, sometimes through the flickering inscriptions on the brass dial, and at other times through the haunting chimes of the bell. The predictions could not be relied upon as straightforward warnings, were riddles embedded within the passage of time. Those who studied it closely often disagreed on what the signs meant, and this uncertainty gave rise to bitter debates. Some argued the tower was a divine instrument, a gift from heaven to guide humanity. Others insisted it was cursed, a relic of dark forces that lured men with cryptic promises of foresight, only to plunge them deeper into fear. The townsfolk, however, did not need scholars or philosophers to tell them what they already felt in their hearts. To them, the clock was alive, an entity that watched and whispered. It's ticking not just the rhythm of hours, but the pulse of destiny itself. Families began to make pilgrimages to the tower, standing beneath its shadow in moments of uncertainty, hoping for signs of what awaited them. Some claimed they received answers in the form of subtle changes to the clock's face. Though outsiders often dismiss such claims as fanciful illusions born of desperation, yet the consistency of these stories troubled even the most hardened skeptics. Over time, the predictions grew darker. The clock's warnings seemed to align not only with small events like storms or fires, but also with larger upheavals that shook the region. Before a great famine, the clock reportedly stopped altogether, its hands refusing to move for 3 full days. Only when the first reports of withered crops arrived did the mechanism resume its motion, as if acknowledging the calamity it had already foreseen. Later, before a regional war broke out, the inscriptions around its dial shifted so dramatically that entire words appeared in symbols previously thought incomprehensible. Witnesses described the markings as resembling an hourglass, flanked by what looked like 2 opposing armies. When battle erupted months later, those who had seen the changes claimed that the clock had tried to warn them of the bloodshed to come. By now, the legend of the clock had spread far beyond the town. Travelers arrived not merely to admire its craftsmanship, but to test its prophetic powers, seeking hints about their futures. Kings and nobles sent emissaries to inquire about its predictions, hoping to gain advantage in politics and war. Some even sought to buy the tower outright, offering vast sums of wealth in exchange for what they believed was the ability to glimpse fate itself. But the townspeople refused. The clock was theirs, a sacred part of their lives, a burden and a blessing that could not be sold. The uncanny predictions created both awe and unease. For while the clock seemed to know what the future held, it offered no guidance on how to change it. Its riddles left people torn between fear and fascination, caught in the grip of a machine that revealed just enough of tomorrow to unsettle. Today, the question that haunted everyone was whether the clock's prophecies were warnings to be heeded or inevitabilities to be endured. And in that uncertainty, its power over the human imagination only grew stronger. As the mysteries surrounding the clock deepened, scholars, philosophers, and engineers from distant lands flocked to the town to unravel its secrets. Each arrived with their own theories, armed with tools of measurement, astronomical charts, and ancient manuscripts that they believed would provide insight into the device's origin. What they encountered, however, challenged not only their knowledge, but also their very perception of reality. The clock was unlike any mechanism they had ever seen. Its gears moved with flawless precision, yet when they attempted to map its functions or replicate its design, they found themselves thwarted by complexities that defied all logic. No one could determine who had built it, nor how it had come to possess the strange ability to predict events. Its construction suggested a mastery of both science and art far beyond anything known at the time. As though it had been crafted by a civilization more advanced than their own. The first group of scholars focused on the clock's mechanics, believing its predictive powers were an illusion rooted in clever engineering. They dismantled smaller sections of the tower, examining the intricate arrangements of cogs, springs, and weights, only to discover that the materials used were not of any familiar origin. The metal, though appearing as bronze, resisted corrosion and bore no signs of wear despite centuries of use. Some argued it was not bronze at all, but a substance yet unknown to metallurgy, while others whispered of celestial origins, claiming it had been forged from materials fallen from the stars. These debates grew heated, with one faction insisting on purely scientific explanations, and another conceding that something otherworldly might indeed be at play at the same time. Philosophers and theologians argued over the symbolic language inscribed on the clock's dial. The markings did not belong to any known alphabet, yet patterns emerged that hinted at meaning. Some claimed they resembled fragments of Sumerian or Egyptian glyphs, while others saw them as proto-languages that predated all human writing. Daring theory proposed that the symbols were not linguistic at all, but mathematical, encoding patterns of cycles and probabilities that revealed themselves through the passage of time. This notion fascinated some and terrified others, for it implied that the clock might not simply predict the future, it might calculate it. If true, then human history itself was bound by equations too vast for ordinary minds to comprehend. Among the scholars was a small sect of astronomers who insisted the clock's predictive abilities were tied to celestial movements. They charted the stars night after night, aligning their observations with the unusual behavior of the clock. They discovered that when the tower gave its most dramatic warnings, such as the 12 tolls before the village fire or the frozen hands before the famine, the heavens had been in rare alignments, with planets crossing paths or eclipses casting shadows across the land. To them, the clock was no ordinary device, but a cosmic instrument, designed to bridge the movements of the stars with the fate of humanity. Yet, even they admitted that the clock's precision surpassed the capacity of any known astronomical tool, leaving them to wonder if its maker had knowledge of the universe that humankind had long since forgotten as debates raged. Rivalries emerged among the scholars. Some accused others of twisting evidence to fit superstitious beliefs, while others warned that dismissing the clock's predictions as coincidence was dangerous arrogance. One particularly vocal philosopher argued that the device was a test, placed in the world to challenge humanity's humility. He warned that seeking to unlock its secrets would invite disaster, for mankind was not meant to see the full tapestry of time. His warnings were largely ignored, yet even his opponents could not deny the unease that gnawed at them whenever the clock defied explanation. The townspeople, watching these learned men quarrel, grew both hopeful and distrustful. On one hand, they believed that if anyone could explain the clock, it would be these scholars. On the other, they feared that probing too deeply into its mysteries might anger the forces that had given it life. Some citizens even accused the scholars of disturbing the balance of the town, claiming that, since their arrival, the clock's predictions had grown more ominous and frequent. Whether this was true or not, the perception created tension between locals and outsiders, with some villagers openly demanding that the scholars leave the clock untouched. Despite all disagreements, there was one point on which the scholars found unity. The clock was more than a mere machine. It was in some way an intelligence. It seemed to respond to attention, its face shifting more dramatically when closely observed, its hands freezing or trembling in moments of heightened scrutiny. On several occasions, groups of scholars recorded identical notes of the clock's anomalies, only to discover the next day that their records had inexplicably changed. Drawings of the dial looked different when compared side by side, as though the clock itself had altered its own appearance between one observation and the next. Such phenomena defied rational explanation and led to whispers among even the most skeptical that the clock was aware of being studied. The dilemma deepened further when the scholars began to experience dreams tied to the clock. Several reported visions of vast landscapes filled with symbols identical to those etched on the dial, and in these dreams, they walked through cities both ancient and futuristic, where time flowed in strange directions. When they compared their dreams, they found uncanny similarities, as if the clock had entered their minds to show them fragments of knowledge beyond the waking world. For some, these visions were enlightening, driving them to devote their lives to deciphering the device. For others, they were terrifying, leaving them restless and broken, fearful of what further revelations might mean. The more they studied, the less certain they became. Was the clock a gift or a curse? Divine instrument meant to guide humanity, or a cruel trick that lured men into endless obsession? Their quest for understanding turned into a mirror of their own doubts and desires, with each scholar seeing in the clock not only the mysteries of the universe, but also the shadows of their own limitations. The clock remained silent in its answers, ticking steadily onward, as though mocking their efforts to grasp what it represented. It offered no clarity, only riddles, and in those riddles, the scholars found themselves trapped in the very dilemma they sought to resolve, torn between the pursuit of knowledge and the fear of truths too vast to endure. The true power of the clock became undeniable when its predictions began to align with events of increasing scale and consequence. At first, its strange tolls and frozen hands had concerned only the people of the town, signaling disasters that were local in nature: fires, floods, shortages of crops. Yet, as time passed, the reach of its warnings seemed to grow, extending far beyond the boundaries of the village. Scholars who had once dismissed its workings as coincidence began to reconsider, for the events foretold were too precise, too devastating, and too improbable to ignore. What unsettled them most was not simply the accuracy of the predictions, but the manner in which the clock revealed them, as though it were aware of both time itself and the human reaction to its revelations. One of the earliest demonstrations of its growing power came on a winter evening when the clock struck 15 times instead of 12, each toll echoing with a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the bones of every listener. Confused and fearful, the townspeople gathered in the square, waiting for something to happen. Days later, news arrived from a neighboring city. An earthquake had struck, leveling buildings and taking countless lives, though the quake had occurred. Miles away, the clock had marked its approach with an intensity that left no room for doubt. The scholars noted the anomaly carefully, questioning how a machine bound within one tower could possibly have known of distant tremors before they struck. Some argued that the device was attuned to the rhythms of the earth, its gears acting as amplifiers of natural signals, while others suggested it was not the quake itself, but the human suffering that had triggered the tolling. Another incident shook both townsfolk and scholars alike when the clock's hands froze at precisely the moment of a solar eclipse. The skies darkened, the world held its breath, and when the shadow passed, the clock resumed ticking. Yet the unsettling part was not the pause itself, but the fact that inscribed upon its face appeared new markings, delicate etchings that no one recalled seeing before. They resembled waves spiraling outward from a single point, and within days, a plague swept across the countryside, spreading in ripples, much like the etched pattern. For the people of the town, this was no longer coincidence but confirmation that the clock not only predicted but in some way recorded or even caused the unfolding of fate. Whether the etchings were warnings or reflections remained hotly debated, but the link between the symbols and the calamities that followed was undeniable. As predictions became more elaborate, so too did the reactions of those who witnessed them. The townsfolk no longer treated the clock as a curiosity but as an oracle. They gathered beneath its tower in times of uncertainty, waiting for signs of what was to come. Leaders began consulting it before making decisions, hesitant to act if the clock seemed unsettled. Some saw this as wisdom, aligning their choices with the supposed guidance of fate. Others feared it was folly, that reliance on the device had replaced human judgment with blind obedience to something not fully understood. The divide deepened, creating factions within the community. Those who revered the clock as a gift from beyond, those who believed it to be a curse that bound their lives in chains of inevitability. The scholars, meanwhile, recorded each occurrence, meticulously, compiling vast tomes of observations. They noted that the clock's predictions followed no fixed schedule. Sometimes it remained silent for months, while at other times it seemed restless, delivering multiple signs within days. This inconsistency troubled them deeply, for it suggested that the clock operated on principles not bound by linear time. Some proposed that it responded only to moments of great significance, while others posited that its workings were connected to human awareness itself, that the act of watching, expecting, somehow drew predictions into being. The more people paid attention, the more often it seemed to react, as though the device thrived on observation. One of the most chilling predictions occurred when the clock's bells rang, not in numbers, but in a sequence of uneven intervals. A stuttering rhythm that defied pattern. Panic spread, for the townspeople could not interpret its meaning. A week later, a caravan of traders brought news of a great war beginning in a far-off land. Battles erupted unpredictably, cities fell without warning, and alliances shattered, like fragile glass. To those who had heard the strange tolling, the connection was clear. The broken rhythm had mirrored the chaos of conflict. A future fractured beyond prediction, yet still somehow foreseen by the clock. From that moment on, the device was no longer just a warning of disasters, but a mirror of history itself. Reflecting the trajectory of human events before they reached their culmination, the deeper the predictions unfolded, the more the question arose. Was the clock simply foretelling events, or was it shaping them? Did its tolls mark inevitabilities that would have occurred regardless, or did its warnings alter the course of human actions, bringing about the very outcomes it seemed to predict? The townspeople argued endlessly over this, some claiming that heeding its warnings saved lives, while others feared that their reliance on it created self-fulfilling prophecies. The scholars, for all their learning, could not resolve the dilemma. If they acted upon a prediction, and it proved true, had the clock been correct, or had their belief in it brought the event to pass? Yet perhaps the most haunting realization was that the clock's predictions grew darker over time, or once it had warned of floods or shortages, now its signs hinted at wars, plagues, catastrophes of a scale that threatened not just a village or city, but entire nations. The shift unsettled all who studied it, raising the possibility that its knowledge extended beyond local happenings into the very fate of the world. Each new toll carried a weight heavier than the last, and with it, the sense that humanity was standing on the edge of a precipice, its future written not in choices but in the cold, relentless ticking of gears within a tower. As the years passed and the clock's influence grew ever stronger, a strange transformation began to occur within the town and beyond. No longer was it merely a machine that measured the passage of hours.
Ow!
It had become a symbol of inevitability, a force that dictated the rhythm of life and death, war and peace, prosperity and despair. What began as curiosity had evolved into fear, and fear into reverence, till the people no longer simply observed the clock, they lived by it. Markets opened and closed according to its chimes. Marriages were delayed or hastened depending on the stillness of its hands, and leaders hesitated to issue decrees until the tower gave no sign of disapproval. It had transcended its role as a device of metal and gears, standing instead as an oracle whose truth could not be questioned. And yet its silence became just as terrifying as its warnings, for in stillness lay the suggestion of secrets too great for human comprehension. The final revelation began with silence. The clock, once restless in its warnings, suddenly ceased its predictions. Its hands ticked along, marking the ordinary hours, yet it gave no toll beyond the normal, no frozen second that foretold disaster, no etching upon its face to signal waves of calamity. For a time the people rejoiced, believing the long nightmare had ended, that the machine had finally exhausted its mysteries. Scholars, however, were uneasy, for absence in something so relentless suggested not peace, but preparation. A predator does not disappear when it is silent. It waits. And so they watched, recording even the emptiness of the clock's behavior, suspecting that its stillness was itself a sign. Months passed, and just as doubt began to take root, the clock broke, its silence in a manner unlike anything before. On a quiet night when the square lay empty, the bells rang not once, not in sequence, but continuously, a deafening roar that rolled across the town like thunder. People rushed from their homes, covering their ears, staring at the tower with terror in their eyes. The sound did not follow any pattern. It was endless, overwhelming, as though time itself had collapsed into a single unbroken moment. And then, as suddenly as it began, the tolling ceased. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound, for when the people dared to look upon the face of the clock, they found its hands had vanished. Where once the markers of time had guided them, there was nothing but an empty circle, polished and cold, as though time itself had been erased. Disappearance of the hands became the most feared omen of all. Without them, no hour could be measured, no moment could be trusted. Day and night lost their meaning, and with them, the order of human life dissolved. Crops went untended, prayers had no appointed times, and the very sense of tomorrow grew uncertain. Some believed the clock had consumed time, swallowing the flow of history into its hidden mechanism. Others insisted that the machine was not broken but had chosen to reveal its final truth, that the end of time itself was drawing near. Fear gripped the town, and despair spread like a contagion, for if time no longer moved, then neither did hope. Yet amid the chaos, a few scholars continued their search for meaning. They studied the tower walls, the gears within, the resonance of the bells. Hidden beneath layers of dust, they discovered inscriptions carved into the foundation. Older than the tower itself, etched in a language long forgotten. After painstaking efforts, they deciphered fragments, warnings of cycles, of endings and beginnings, of a mechanism built not to measure time but to hold it. The clock, they realized, was not a mere instrument but a vessel, a prison that contained the flow of existence itself. Its tolls had been the tremors of something vast and unseen. Straining against its boundaries, pressing closer with each passing year, the scholars concluded that the silence had not been peace, but the moment before release. And the endless tolling was the sound of the prison's gates breaking open. Time itself had been set free, but not in the orderly march humanity had always known. Instead, it was unraveling, folding upon itself, moments bleeding into one another. Villagers began to report strange occurrences, children who remembered events that had not yet happened, old men who claimed to relive their youth in dreams that felt real.
Shadows of people
Walking in the streets, only to vanish when approached. The fabric of reality thinned, and the boundaries between past, present, and future collapsed, leaving all moments tangled in a web too complex for human minds to grasp. The clock, standing silent with its empty face, loomed over this unraveling world like a monument to inevitability. The townspeople no longer gathered beneath it for guidance, for there was nothing left to guide. Every choice was already made, every outcome already known, every life merely an echo of itself in the shifting maze of time. The scholars, driven by obsession, argued until their last breath whether the clock had predicted this end or caused it, whether humanity had always been bound to this unraveling, or whether their faith in the machine had sealed their fate. The clock offered no answers, no final toll, no sound of reassurance, only silence, vast and endless, in which the last remnants of certainty dissolved. And so the clock that had once predicted the future revealed its final truth, not in words or chimes, but in the collapse of the very concept of future itself. Time no longer moved forward. It simply existed in fragments, scattered like broken glass across eternity, shard reflecting a different possibility, each one as real and unreal as the next. The people, the town, the world were left to wander those fragments, forever uncertain whether they lived in the past, the present, or the future, for all three had become one and the same. Held within the silent, watchful presence of the tower and its vanished hands,